My name is Daniel Cross, and for 36 years I believed my life was, if not extraordinary, at least mine solid, predictable, built brick by brick on choices I understood. I had a good job as a project manager at a logistics firm downtown. I had a wife, Claire, whom I had married 8 years earlier, in a small ceremony behind her parents' house. Under a string of lights her mother had spent 2 days untangling. And I had a daughter, Aisha, 7 years old, with her mother's stubborn chin and my habit of humming when she concentrated. We lived in a modest 2-story house on Birchwood Lane, the kind of street where the mail carrier knew everyone's dog by name, and the neighborhood watch group argued more about lawn ornaments than actual crime. It was not a glamorous life. It was, however, a life I had fought for through years of long hours, through the terror of Claire's difficult pregnancy, through the quiet, grinding work of building something stable out of 2 people who had both grown up in homes that weren't. And for 3 years, at the center of our household's daily rhythm, there was Rehana. Rehana Malik had come to us through an agency when Aisha was 4, not long after Claire went back to work full-time as a hospital administrator. She was in her late 30s then, quiet in a way that took some getting used to, with a habit of tilting her head slightly when she listened, as though she were trying to hear something beneath the words themselves. She cooked, she cleaned, she picked Aisha up from school on the days Claire's shifts ran long, and somewhere in the accumulation of 1,000 small tasks, she had become something more than an employee. She had become family, or so I believed. I want to be honest about something before I go further into this story. I am not a naturally suspicious man. My mother used to say I would trust a wolf if it wore a name tag. Claire used to tease me about it too, how I never questioned the mechanic's estimate, never doubted a salesman's pitch, never once, in 8 years of marriage, wondered what Claire did during the hours she said she was working late. I trusted people because distrust felt like a burden I didn't want to carry, and because, until the day this story begins, nothing in my life had ever given me a reason to. That changed on a Tuesday in March. Before I go further, I think it's worth explaining a little more about who we were as a family, because I want this story to mean something beyond its shock value, beyond the headline version of events that people tend to remember. Claire and I met in our late 20s, both of us a little bruised by the relationships that came before, both of us cautious in the particular way people are when they've been disappointed once too often to trust easily again. She worked the overnight shift at Ridgeway General back then, in admissions, and I met her at a mutual friend's barbecue where she spent 45 minutes arguing with me about whether pineapple belonged on pizza, an argument I lost decisively and have never quite recovered from. We dated for 2 years before we married, and another 2 years before we decided to try for a child, a decision that came with more fear than either of us admitted to each other at the time. Claire's mother had lost 3 pregnancies before Claire was born, and Claire had grown up with the quiet, unspoken understanding that her own body might carry the same difficulty. When she finally did get pregnant, we treated the entire 9 months like something fragile and miraculous, holding our breath through every appointment, every ultrasound, every small milestone. The birth itself was long and complicated 18 hours of labor that ended, eventually, in an emergency situation that required Claire to be rushed into a separate operating room, while I was left in a waiting area, terrified, for nearly 40 minutes without any word on what was happening. When a nurse finally came to get me, she was moving quickly, and the whole experience had the disorienting, fragmented quality of a memory assembled after the fact, rather than lived through in real time. I remember being led down one hallway, then another, and being handed a small bundle wrapped in a hospital blanket, and being told, "Congratulations, Mr. Cross, you have a healthy baby girl." I have thought about that moment more than almost any other moment in this entire story, because I now understand that somewhere in those 40 minutes of chaos and fear, in the shuffle of 2 babies born within the same hour, on the same understaffed night, on a ward that Amina would later admit was operating with 2 fewer nurses than the schedule required somewhere in there, my daughter and the Whitfield's daughter changed places, and nobody noticed, and nobody would notice for 3 years, and nobody would know for 7. I did not know any of this on that Tuesday morning in March when I got up, kissed Claire goodbye as she left for an early shift, and drove to work, expecting nothing more unusual than a routine client meeting about shipping contracts. I want you to understand how ordinary that morning was, because I think part of what makes this story so unsettling to people who hear it is the realization that catastrophe rarely announces itself. It does not arrive with thunder. It arrives, usually, in the most mundane possible circumstances: a canceled meeting, an empty afternoon, a decision to drive home a few hours early. I remember the weather because it mattered later. A fine, cold drizzle, the kind that doesn't soak you, but makes you feel damp all the way through, as if the day itself were trying to warn you. I had a client meeting scheduled for 2 o'clock, a routine check-in about a shipping contract renewal. Nothing that should have taken more than 45 minutes. But the client, a man named Harrison Voss, called at 1:30 to say he'd been held up at the airport and would need to reschedule, which meant, for the first time in longer than I could remember, I had an entire free afternoon on a weekday, and nowhere urgent to be. I sat in my car in the parking garage for a few minutes, feeling the strange, almost giddy sensation of unclaimed time. I thought about going to the gym. I thought about surprising Claire at the hospital with coffee. In the end, I did neither. I drove home. I want to be clear that there was nothing sinister in this decision. I did not suspect Rahana of anything. I did not have some instinct, some tightening in my gut that told me something was wrong. I simply wanted to go home, make myself a sandwich, and maybe surprise Aisha when she got back from school, since Rahana usually picked her up around 3:15. I pulled into the driveway at 2:40. Rahana's small gray hatchback was already there, which surprised me slightly. She didn't usually collect Aisha until later, but I assumed the school might have let out early, or there had been some change in the schedule I wasn't aware of. Looking back now, I realized the school had in fact dismissed an hour early that day for a teacher training session, a detail buried somewhere in a newsletter I had skimmed and forgotten weeks earlier, the kind of small administrative note that means nothing until, suddenly, it means everything, because it happened to align with the one afternoon I also came home unannounced. I let myself in through the side door, the one that led into the kitchen, the way I always did, expecting to find the ordinary tableau of our afternoons. Rahana at the counter, radio playing low, maybe Ayesha's backpack already slung over a chair, a glass of milk half finished on the table, the particular domestic clutter that had come to feel like the backdrop of my entire adult life. Instead, the kitchen was empty. The radio was off. The house had the particular stillness of a place where people are trying not to be heard. And then I heard Rehana's voice. It was coming from down the hall, from the direction of Aisha's bedroom, and it was pitched low, not the warm, sing-song voice she used with Aisha, but something tighter, more urgent. I stopped in the kitchen doorway, one hand still on the frame, and listened without meaning to, the way you do when a voice in another room doesn't sound like itself. "Don't come out until I tell you," she was saying. "Stay there. Please, Baba, just stay there a little longer." My first thought, and I want to be honest about this, because I think it says something about how thoroughly I had trusted this woman, my first thought was that something was wrong. That there was an intruder, or a gas leak, or some danger I couldn't see, and Rehana was protecting my daughter from it the way she had protected her from 100 smaller things over 3 years. A wasp in the garden, a pot of boiling water, a strange dog on the sidewalk. I moved down the hallway quietly, some instinct keeping my footsteps soft on the carpet, some deeper instinct, the one I would later wish I had listened to sooner and trusted less, telling me to listen before I acted. Rehana was standing just outside Aisha's closed bedroom door, her phone pressed to her ear, her back to the hallway. Aisha, it seemed, was inside the room, the door shut, and whatever Rehana was doing, she was doing it in the narrow space of hallway between the door and the top of the stairs. I stopped where I was, hidden by the turn of the hall, and I listened. "She doesn't know," Rehana was saying, and her voice had a tremor in it I had never heard before. Not once in 3 years. "He doesn't know either. If he finds out that Aisha isn't," she stopped. There was a long pause, the kind that meant someone on the other end of the call was speaking, and I stood frozen against the wall, my heart doing something strange and heavy in my chest, my mind already racing ahead of the sentence she hadn't finished, filling in the blank with the worst thing I could imagine. "Isn't his—" "I know," Rehana said finally. "I know I should have told them years ago, but look at her, Amina. Look at how happy she is. If I take that away now—" Another pause. "She's not just some Sheen. She's not a job to me anymore. You know that. You've always known that. I don't remember deciding to open the door. I remember my hand was already on it, and I remember Rehana's face when she turned and saw me standing there, the phone still against her ear, her mouth open on a word she never finished saying. The phone slipped from her hand and hit the carpet with a soft, anticlimactic thud. "Daniel," she said. You're home early. Who isn't Aisha's?" I said. My own voice sounded strange to me. too flat, too controlled, as though I were speaking from somewhere outside my own body. Finish the sentence, Rehana. Who isn't Aisha's? I have relived the next 20 minutes of my life more times than I can count. I have turned them over in my mind so many times that I sometimes wonder if I am remembering the actual conversation, or a version of it worn smooth by repetition, the way a stone in a river loses its edges. But I will tell it here as faithfully as I can, because it deserves to be told faithfully, even the parts that make me look foolish, even the parts that still, all these months later, make my chest tighten. Rehana did not try to lie to me. I want to say that clearly, because in the version of this story I told myself in the days afterward, in my anger, I sometimes cast her as a villain, a schemer, a woman who had infiltrated my family under false pretenses. But that was never quite true, and by the end of that conversation in the hallway outside my daughter's door, I understood it wasn't true. She sat down on the top stair, her legs seeming to give out from under her, and she put her face in her hands for a moment before she spoke. 3 years ago, she said, before I ever came to work for you and Claire, I have a cousin, Amina, who was a nurse at Ridgeway General, on the maternity ward, the same hospital where Aisha was born." End quote. I remember feeling the floor tilt slightly beneath me, though I hadn't moved. There was an error, Rehana continued. A mix-up in the nursery, 2 baby girls, born within an hour of each other, on the same night, in the same ward. Somewhere between the nursery and the rooms, the bracelets the mothers were given the wrong babies. "That's not possible," I said. I remember saying it with a kind of flat certainty, as though saying it firmly enough would make it true. "That doesn't happen. Hospitals have systems for that. Barcodes, verification." "It happened," Rehana said quietly. "It happens more than anyone likes to admit, Daniel. Amina discovered it 3 days later, when she was reviewing the footprint records against the file photographs, and by then both families had already gone home. She was terrified. She could have lost her job, her license, she could have been sued, prosecuted even. She came to me because I was the only person she trusted, and because here, Rehana's voice caught, because the other family was hers too, in a way. The other baby, the one your wife actually gave birth to, went home with a young couple, the Whitfields, who live 2 towns over. And your Aisha, the little girl you've raised for 7 years, is their biological daughter. I want to tell you that I responded to this with some kind of composure, some measured, adult reaction befitting the gravity of what I was hearing. I did not. I laughed. It was an ugly, disbelieving sound, and I remember Rehana flinching at it. "You're telling me," I said, "that for 3 years, you've worked in my house, cared for my daughter, eaten dinner at my table knowing this? Knowing that Aisha isn't that there's another child somewhere who, I applied for this job because of it," Rehana said, and this, more than anything else, was the sentence that broke something loose in me. "Amina told me what had happened, and she begged me not to say anything. She said it would destroy her career, maybe worse. And I didn't know what to do. I couldn't tell you. I couldn't tell the Whitfields. I didn't have proof beyond Amina's word, and even if I did, what would it have done except tear 2 families apart over something none of you did wrong? So I told myself I would just watch. I would find a way to be close to the situation, to make sure both girls were safe, cared for, loved. When I saw that your family was looking for a housekeeper who could also help with childcare, I applied. I told myself it was only until I figured out what to do. And in 3 years, I said, you never figured it out. In 3 years, Rehana said, and now she was crying, openly, the careful composure she always carried, dissolving completely. I fell in love with your daughter, not the idea of her. Her, Aisha, who hums while she draws, who refuses to eat anything green unless it's disguised, who cried for a week when her goldfish died, and insisted on a funeral with a paper crown. I told myself every day that I would find the courage to tell you the truth, and every day I looked at her and thought, what good does the truth do her? What does she gain from learning the people who raised her aren't the people who made her? And so I said nothing. I have said nothing for 3 years, and I am not proud of that, Daniel. I have hated myself for it more nights than you would believe, but I could not make myself be the person who broke this family apart. I sat down on the floor of the hallway, my back against the wall, because my legs would no longer hold me. Through the door beside me, I could hear the soft, muffled sound of Aisha talking to herself to her stuffed animals. Probably, in the private, elaborate narrations she constructed for them, utterly unaware that on the other side of that door, the entire architecture of her world had just been quietly, irrevocably cracked. How did you find out it wasn't a mistake she could be wrong about? I asked Rehanna, once I could speak again. My voice sounded strange in my own ears, thin and far away. Nurses make errors in paperwork all the time. Maybe your cousin misread something. Maybe she panicked over nothing. I asked her the same thing, Rehanna said. More than once, over the years, hoping she would tell me I was right, that it had been a false alarm. She showed me the photographs, Daniel. The hospital takes a photograph of every newborn within the first hour, before the mothers are even fully out of recovery, for the identification records. Amina compared the timestamps against the room assignments, against the discharge paperwork. The baby photographed as Cross, baby girl at 11:42 that night, was moved, 40 minutes later, into a different room than the one your wife was in. She has never been able to explain it any other way. She has tried. Believe me, she has spent 3 years trying to find another explanation, because the one she has is the one that could end her career. Why didn't she just fix it then? I said, and I could hear the anger climbing back into my voice, directionless, looking for somewhere to land. 3 days later, before we even brought Aisha home, why not go to a supervisor immediately? She was 24 years old, Rehanna said quietly. It was her first year as a registered nurse. She had worked for 4 years to get through school, through certification, and she was terrified that admitting a mistake of this size would end everything before it had properly begun. I am not defending her, Daniel. I have told her more times than I can count that she should have said something immediately, that every day of silence made the eventual truth harder to survive. But I understand the fear that kept her quiet, even if I don't excuse it. Fear does strange things to good people. It convinces them that silence is smaller than it actually is. I sat with that for a long moment, staring at the closed door of my daughter's room, listening to the muffled sound of her voice on the other side, narrating some small drama involving, I would learn later, a stuffed rabbit and a plastic dinosaur, who were apparently in the middle of an elaborate disagreement about who got to be king of the blanket fort. And you, I said finally, you've known for 3 years. You came into my house, into my daughter's life, and you never once considered that I had a right to know this about my own child? I considered it every single day, Rehanna said, and for the first time her composure broke entirely, tears running freely down her face, without her making any effort to stop them. I am not going to pretend to you that I made the brave choice, or the right choice, because I don't believe I did. I made the choice that let me sleep at night without believing I had destroyed a child's entire sense of safety in the world. I told myself, every single day, that tomorrow I would find the courage. And every tomorrow I looked at Aisha and thought of some new reason to wait a little longer. I did not tell Claire that evening. I want to explain why, because I think it matters, and because in the aftermath, this decision became one of the things Claire and I fought about most bitterly. I told myself I needed to think. I told myself I needed to be sure before I brought this into our marriage, before I said words that could never be unsaid. But if I am honest, and this whole story only has value if I am honest, I think the real reason was simpler and more cowardly than that. I was afraid. I was afraid that if I said it out loud, it would become real in a way it hadn't yet fully become real in the silence of my own skull. I was afraid of watching Claire's face when I told her that the daughter she had breastfed, potty-trained, nursed through fevers, and driven to 100 pediatrician appointments might not be the child her body had made. So instead, I made dinner. I helped Aisha with her spelling homework. The word list that week included family, which I remember because I had to stop for a moment, my pen hovering over the paper, before I could keep helping her sound it out. I put her to bed. I read her 2 chapters of the book we were working through, a story about a fox who wanted to be a bird, and I kissed her forehead and told her I loved her, and the words came out steady even though I did not feel steady at all. Rehanna had left before Claire got home, but not before we'd had one more conversation, standing in the driveway in the gray evening light. "What will you do?" she asked me. "I don't know," I said. "I need to think. I need to find out if this is even true, before I destroy 2 families based on a story." "It's true," Rehanna said. "I wish it weren't. But it's true. How do I find out for certain?" "A DNA test," she said. "That's the only way anyone will believe it, including you." I nodded, and she got into her small gray car and drove away, and I stood in my driveway for a long time afterward, watching the space where her car had been, feeling as though the ground beneath the entire structure of my life had shifted a few inches, and nothing would ever sit quite flush again. I did not sleep that night. I lay next to Claire, who slept the way she always did, one arm thrown over her face, and I stared at the ceiling and thought about Aisha's laugh, which was Claire's laugh, or was it? Was it something I had simply decided was Claire's laugh, because I expected to see Claire in her? I thought about the shape of Aisha's ears, which I had always privately thought resembled mine, and wondered if I had imagined that resemblance into existence the way parents sometimes do, seeing themselves in a child because they want to, not because it's there. By 4 in the morning, I had made a decision. I would find out the truth before I said a word to Claire, if it was false, if Rahana had been mistaken, or her cousin had been mistaken, or the whole story dissolved under the light of an actual test, then I would never have to put Claire through the agony of even considering it. And if it was true, then I would find a way to tell her that didn't feel like an ambush, that gave her some ground to stand on before the floor disappeared. I want to skip past the mechanics of how I obtained a DNA testing kit and collected samples without Claire noticing, except to say that it took me 4 days, that I felt like a criminal collecting evidence in my own home, and that I hated every moment of it, swabbing the inside of Aisha's cheek under the pretense of a game, mailing a saliva sample from a lab I researched obsessively to make sure it was reputable, staring at my phone for the entire 6 days it took to process, checking the tracking status of an email that felt like it might contain the end of the world. The results came back on a Thursday afternoon while I was at work. I remember I was in a meeting about warehouse capacity projections when the notification came through on my phone, and I excused myself so abruptly that my colleagues later asked if I'd gotten bad medical news. In a sense, I had. I sat in my car in the parking garage, the same parking garage where, 11 days earlier, I had made the small, unremarkable decision to drive home early, and I opened the email. The probability of paternal relationship, 0.00%. I sat there for a long time. I don't know how long. Long enough that the garage's automatic lights, motion activated, clicked off around me, and I had to wave my arm to bring them back on. Aisha was not my biological daughter. Everything Rahana had told me was true. I drove home that afternoon instead of returning to the office. I don't remember much of the drive itself. It exists in my memory as a kind of blur, streetlights and intersections passing without registering, the radio on but unheard. What I do remember, vividly, is pulling into the driveway and sitting there for nearly an hour, unable to make myself go inside, watching the lit windows of my own house, as though it belonged to someone else's life. Aisha's silhouette crossed the living room window twice while I sat there once chasing something, maybe the dog from next door that sometimes got loose, and once simply walking, unhurried. The particular loose-limbed gait she had inherited, I now understood, from absolutely no one in my family or Claire's. I found myself cataloging her, almost clinically, searching for features I had always assumed were ours, and now wondered whether I had simply willed into existence. Her ears, I had always said she had my ears, the same slight point at the top that my grandmother used to call pixie ears when I was small. Looking at her silhouette in the window, I found I could no longer tell if that resemblance was real or something I had constructed, the way parents sometimes do, finding themselves in a child because they expect to, because the alternative is too strange to consider. I thought about my own father, who had died when I was 19, and how much of my understanding of fatherhood had been built on the idea of continuity, that some essential thread ran from him to me, to whatever children I eventually had, a thread of blood and features and temperament that connected us across generations even when nothing else did. I sat in that driveway and felt that thread, which I had never once questioned in 36 years, simply dissolve. Eventually, the cold drove me inside, more than any resolve. I told Claire I'd had a headache all day, which was not entirely a lie, and I went through the motions of that evening, the way a man moves through a house he no longer fully recognizes as his own. I told Claire that night, after Aisha was asleep, sitting across from her at our kitchen table, the same table where we'd eaten 10,000 meals as a family, where Aisha had once glued macaroni to a paper plate for a school project and declared it the best art in the whole world. I told her everything: Rahana's conversation in the hallway, the story about her cousin Amina, the DNA test I had taken without telling her first. I watched Claire's face move through disbelief, then confusion, then a kind of white, unmoving shock that frightened me more than tears would have. "You did this without telling me?" she said finally, and her voice was quiet in a way that was worse than shouting. "You took our daughter's DNA, you tested whether she was really ours, and you didn't think to include me in that decision?" "I didn't want to put this on you until I knew if it was real," I said. I didn't want you to spend a week thinking our daughter might not be Souther's. I wanted to protect you from that if I could. You don't get to decide what I need protecting from, Claire said, and she stood up so fast her chair scraped hard against the floor. That's not protection, Daniel. That's you deciding you'd rather carry a secret alone than trust me to carry it with you. Do you understand how that feels? To find out you've been sitting with this for a week, running tests behind my back, while I was at work thinking everything was normal? I didn't have a good answer for her, because she was right, and I think some part of me had known she would be right, even as I made the choice to keep it from her. We didn't speak for the rest of that night, or for much of the next 3 days. Claire slept in the guest room. I lay awake in our bed alone, listening to the house settle around me, thinking about how quickly a single overheard sentence in a hallway had managed to crack open every relationship in my life at once. It was Claire in the end who insisted we needed to find the other family, the Whitfields, despite her anger at how she'd learned the truth. I think it was her way of taking back some control over a situation that had been handled without her for too long already. If there's a little girl out there who is biologically ours, Claire said, on the 4th day, when we finally sat down together properly, then I need to know her. I need to at least know that she's safe, that she's loved, that whatever happened to her wasn't worse than what happened to us. Rihanna, when we contacted her again, and I want to note that this conversation happened only after several days in which I did not speak to her at all, unable to reconcile my anger at her silence with my recognition of the impossible position she'd been in, Rihanna gave us Amina's contact information. Amina, for her part, was terrified. She had built a career on the assumption that this error would never surface, and now here we were, threatening to unravel it. But to her credit, once she understood we weren't interested in destroying her, only in the truth, she helped us. She confirmed the hospital records, the dates, the room assignments. She gave us, eventually, the name and address of the family who had unknowingly taken home a little girl who was Claire's and mine. The Whitfields lived in Millbrook, a town about 40 minutes from us, a place I had driven through a dozen times, without ever once imagining it contained anything that belonged to me. Before we ever spoke to Amina directly, Claire insisted on doing her own research into the hospital's records, partly out of a deep, understandable need to verify every piece of this story for herself, rather than relying entirely on second-hand accounts. Her position at a different hospital gave her some understanding of how administrative systems worked, and for nearly 2 weeks she spent her evenings after Aisha went to bed combing through what public records she could access, cross-referencing birth announcements from the local paper against the dates Rihanna had given us, trying to build an independent picture of what had happened before she would allow herself to believe it. I need to know this isn't some kind of manipulation, she told me one night, hunched over her laptop at the kitchen table, the blue light of the screen making her look tired in a way that went deeper than lack of sleep. I need to know Rihanna isn't tied, no. Daniel, running some kind of scheme, or confused, or lying to protect her cousin from something else entirely. I understood her caution, even as it frustrated me, because I had already lived through my own version of that same doubt during the 6 days I waited for the DNA results. But Claire's research, methodical and careful in the way she approached everything, eventually turned up a birth announcement in the local paper for a baby girl named Lily Whitfield, born at Ridgeway General on the same date as Aisha, to parents Mark and Sarah Whitfield of Millbrook. It was a small thing, a few lines of newsprint, but seeing it made the whole story solidify into something undeniably real for both of us, in a way that even the DNA results, strangely, had not quite managed. We did not simply show up on their doorstep. Rihanna, through Amina, made a careful, cautious first contact, a letter, then a phone call, giving the Whitfields time to absorb the same devastating information we had been forced to absorb, without an audience, without pressure. It took 3 weeks before both families agreed to meet. I will never forget that meeting as long as I live. It took place in a quiet corner of a public park, chosen deliberately as neutral ground, away from any home that might feel like an intrusion. Mark and Sarah Whitfield arrived with their daughter, a girl named Lily, 7 years old, with dark hair and a serious, watchful expression that I recognized immediately, because I saw it every morning in the mirror on the days I hadn't slept well. It was my mother's expression, actually the exact set of the mouth she got when she was working something out in her head before speaking. Claire made a sound beside me that wasn't quite a sob and wasn't quite a laugh, something caught between the two, because Lily, it turned out, had Claire's eyes exactly not similar, not close, but exactly, down to the particular hazel green color that Claire always said skipped generations in her family. I won't pretend the months that followed were simple, because they weren't, and I think any story that claims otherwise is lying to make itself easier to swallow. Mark and Sarah Whitfield were, understandably, wary at first, even hostile, in Mark's case, for the first several meetings. He was a proud man, an accountant with a precise, orderly way of thinking about the world, and the idea that the daughter he had raised for 7 years might not be his by blood, while a stranger's biological daughter had been raised as our own, offended some deep sense of order in him that took a long time to settle. "I don't care what a piece of paper says," he told me during one particularly tense conversation, standing in the parking lot of a coffee shop where we'd agreed to meet without our daughters, so the adults could speak freely. "Lily is my daughter. I was in the room when she took her first steps. I don't know this Aisha. I don't owe her anything." "I understand that," I told him, because I did understand it, more than I think he realized. "I feel exactly the same way about Aisha. I'm not asking you to stop being Lily's father. I'm asking whether we can find some way for our daughters to know each other, if they want to, without either of us pretending nothing happened." It took Sarah, in the end, to soften things between us. She was a gentler presence than Mark, more curious than afraid, and she was the one who first suggested that maybe there didn't need to be a single right way to handle this, that maybe families could be larger and stranger than the tidy shape we'd always assumed they had to take. "I keep thinking about it," she told Claire, during one of the many long conversations the two women had over that spring, conversations I was mostly not privy to, and which I think, in some ways, did more to heal both families than anything Mark or I managed. "I carried Lily for 9 months. I know every part of her. But somewhere out there, there's a woman who carried a different girl for 9 months, and never got to raise her, and doesn't even know it happened. Doesn't that feel like something we owe her? Not to replace anything, just to acknowledge it." Claire cried when she told me that. I think it was the first time since the whole ordeal began that she cried out of something other than anger or grief, something closer to recognition, the sense of being understood by someone who was living through the exact same impossible situation. The two families met perhaps a dozen times over those first months, always carefully, always with the children kept separate from the heaviest conversations, though of course 7-year-olds are far more perceptive than adults like to give them credit for, and I think both Aisha and Lily understood, on some instinctive level, that something significant was happening long before anyone explained it to them directly. One afternoon in early June stands out to me clearly. We had arranged for both families to meet at a small lake an hour outside the city, a neutral, pleasant place with a public beach and rental canoes, chosen specifically because it offered enough activity to keep the children occupied while the adults talked. Mark had brought a cooler of drinks, an oddly formal gesture that Claire later told me she found strangely moving his way, perhaps, of trying to participate in something he still didn't fully know how to feel about. I remember watching Aisha and Lily from a distance, sitting on a picnic blanket with Claire and Sarah, while Mark and I stood near the water's edge, not talking much, both of us watching both of our daughters, in the strange new accounting this situation required, build an elaborate sandcastle together, arguing amiably about whether it needed a moat. "They don't know," Mark said eventually, not looking at me, his eyes fixed on the two girls. "They just think we're friends who met through work or something. They have no idea what they are to each other." "Does it feel different to you?" I asked him. "Watching her with Lily?" Mark was quiet for a long time before he answered. "I keep looking for something," he said, "some sign, some feeling, that would tell me this is real, that Aisha is actually mine, in whatever way that word means now, and I don't feel it. I feel like I'm watching my daughter play with a very nice little girl I don't know very well yet." "Is that a terrible thing to admit?" "No," I said, because I understood exactly what he meant, having felt something disturbingly similar every time I looked at Lily, searching her face for a connection that stubbornly refused to announce itself, simply because science said it should be there. I think that's just true. Blood doesn't come with feelings attached. We're the ones who have to build those, if we want them at all. We did not tell Aisha the full truth right away. Every counselor we consulted, and we consulted several, because neither Claire nor I trusted our own judgment enough by that point to make the decision alone, advised us to move slowly, to let her form a relationship with Lily and the Whitfield family organically, as family friends, before introducing the more complicated truth of what that relationship actually was. It took nearly 8 months before we sat Aisha down and explained it to her, in the simplest language we could find, with a child psychologist present to help her process what she was hearing. I remember her face during that conversation more clearly than almost anything else in this whole ordeal. The way her eyebrows drew together, the way she looked back and forth between Claire and me, as though checking that we were still the same people she'd woken up believing we were. "So you're not my real mom and dad?" she asked, and the question landed in my chest like a physical blow. "We are your real mom and dad," Claire said, and her voice did not waver, though I knew what it cost her to keep it steady. "Real isn't about how you got born, sweetheart. Real is about who shows up. We are the ones who showed up every single day of your life, and we always will. But Lily is like my sister, except not really. Lily's mom carried you inside her body before you were born," I told her, choosing each word as carefully as I have ever chosen anything in my life. "And Lily's parents took a different baby home from the hospital by accident. A baby who grew up to be you, in our house, with us. It was a mistake nobody meant to make. It doesn't change that you're our daughter. It just means you have some extra family now, if you want them." Aisha was quiet for a long time. Then she asked the question that, of everything in this entire story, has stayed with me the longest. Does Rihanna get to still be my Rihanna? It was such a small question, phrased in such small, childlike terms, and yet it undid me more than almost anything else that had happened in the entire preceding year. Claire had to answer for both of us, because I found I could not speak. "Yes, baby," Claire said. "Rihanna will always be your Rihanna. That's never going to change." Aisha nodded slowly, as though filing this piece of information away in whatever internal system children use to reorganize their understanding of the world when it shifts beneath them. Then she asked a second question, one that the counselor later told us was remarkably sophisticated for a child her age. A sign, she said, that Aisha was processing this with more emotional maturity than either Claire or I had managed in the early weeks. "Is Lily sad that she didn't get to grow up with you and Mommy?" "I don't know if sad is the right word," I told her, choosing my words as carefully as I had chosen any words in my life. "I think Lily is figuring out how she feels, just like you are. But she has a mom and dad who love her very much, the same way we love you. Nobody lost anything that matters most. We just found out our family is bigger and more complicated than we thought. Can I still be friends with her even though it's weird?" "You can be whatever you want to be with her," Claire said, smiling despite the tears still drying on her face. "Friends, sisters, something in between that doesn't have a name yet. That part is entirely up to you." In the weeks that followed, Aisha approached the whole situation with a directness that put the adults around her to shame. She began referring to Lily, without any prompting from us, as her twin sister who isn't a twin, a phrase she'd apparently invented herself, and which she deployed with such matter-of-fact confidence at school that her teacher called us in for a conference, worried the phrase indicated some kind of confusion or distress. It did not. When we explained the actual situation to the teacher, she simply nodded and said that in 15 years of teaching, she had never heard a 7-year-old describe a genuinely complicated situation with such uncomplicated clarity. This is, I think, the part of the story that surprises people most, when I tell it the fact that Rihanna remained in our lives at all, given everything. I understand the instinct to see her as someone who deceived us, who withheld a truth she had no right to withhold, who inserted herself into our family under false pretenses, for reasons that, however sympathetic, were still fundamentally about protecting herself and her cousin from consequences. And there were months when I felt exactly that anger, sharp and unresolved. There were nights I lay awake furious at her, rehearsing arguments I never had the chance to make, because by the time my anger cooled enough to speak calmly, the moment for shouting had passed. But here is what I came to understand, slowly, over that long and difficult year. Rihanna had been the only person, in the entire unraveling of this story, who had thought first and consistently about what was best for the children, not for herself, not for either set of parents, not for the tidy resolution of a terrible mistake, but for two little girls who had done nothing wrong and stood to lose everything stable in their lives, no matter how the truth came out. She had made an imperfect choice, staying silent for 3 years. I do not think it was the right choice. I told her so, eventually, in a conversation that was one of the hardest of my life, sitting in our kitchen with Claire beside me, both of us finally calm enough to speak without shouting. "You should have told us the day you found out," I said. "Not 3 years later. You took years away from us, years we could have spent knowing the truth, adjusting to it while Aisha was still small enough that it might have been simpler." "I know," Rihanna said. She did not defend herself. She had stopped defending herself weeks earlier, I think, somewhere in the long, grinding process of watching two families try to rebuild something out of the wreckage her silence had both caused and, in its strange way, protected. I have asked myself every day since whether I made the right choice, and I don't have an answer. I only know that I love that little girl the way I would love my own child, and I could not find the courage to be the one who took her whole world apart. I am not asking you to forgive that. I am only telling you it's true. Claire was the one who reached out and took Rihanna's hand. In the end, Claire, who I think had struggled with her own anger toward Rihanna even more than I had, precisely because Claire's grief over the years she'd lost was rawer, closer to the surface. "You're staying," Claire said. It wasn't a question. Aisha needs you. Whatever else is true, that part is true too. I have not, up to this point, said much about Ridgeway General itself, or about what happened once the truth of the switch became something both families were prepared to act on, rather than simply absorb privately. I think it's worth including, because it shaped a difficult, practical layer of this story that ran alongside the emotional one, and because I know some people who hear this story want to know whether anyone was ever held accountable for what happened. Once both families had independently confirmed the truth, Claire through her own research, the Whitfields through a DNA test of their own, arranged quietly through their family physician, we were faced with a decision neither Claire nor I had anticipated having to make. Amina, Rihanna's cousin, had by then left her position at Ridgeway General for an unrelated job at a private clinic, but the hospital itself remained liable, in a strictly legal sense, for an error of this magnitude, and more than one lawyer we consulted in those early weeks encouraged us to consider a lawsuit. Claire was the one who raised the question first, in the flat, careful tone she used when she was working through something practical rather than emotional. "Do we sue them?" she asked me one night. "Legally, we could. What they did or failed to do changed the entire course of two children's lives. There should be consequences for that," understood, the impulse. And there were nights I felt it myself. A hot, directionless anger that wanted somewhere official to land, some institution to hold responsible for the years of not knowing that had been quietly stolen from us. But the more we discussed it with the Whitfields, the clearer it became that neither family actually wanted a prolonged legal battle, with its depositions and public records and inevitable media attention, playing out over the heads of two 7-year-old girls who were only just beginning to understand their own situation. "I don't want Lily's childhood dragged through a courtroom," Sarah told us, during one of the more difficult conversations the four of us had, sitting around Claire's kitchen table with cups of tea going cold in front of us. "I don't want her growing up knowing her name is attached to a lawsuit before she's old enough to understand what any of it means." Mark agreed, though I could tell it cost him something to let go of the anger that had driven him, in the earliest weeks, to talk openly about making the hospital pay for what had happened. "I keep thinking about what I actually want out of this," he said, turning his coffee cup slowly in his hands without drinking from it. "And it isn't money. It isn't even really an apology, not from some hospital administrator who wasn't even working there when it happened. What I want is some assurance that this doesn't happen to another family. That's the only kind of justice that actually means anything to me at this point." That sentiment, more than any legal strategy, ended up shaping the path both families eventually took. Not a public reckoning, but a quiet, insistent pressure applied through the joint complaint and the review it triggered, aimed less at punishment and more at making sure the specific chain of small failures that had led to our daughters being switched could never quietly repeat itself in some other family's story. In the end, we pursued something quieter, a formal complaint filed jointly by both families, which triggered an internal review at the hospital, along with a settlement that Ridgeway General's legal team offered before either family had to formally file suit, presumably eager to avoid the reputational damage a public case would have caused. The hospital also implemented new identification protocols on its maternity ward as a direct result of the review, a small, procedural change that neither family witnessed directly, but which both of us, I think, took some quiet comfort in the knowledge that whatever this cost us, it had at least made it slightly less likely to happen to some other family in the future. Amina, for her part, wrote us both a letter, one to our family, one to the Whitfields, that I have kept in a drawer in my desk to this day, though I have not reread it in some time. It was not an excuse. It was, as close as I can describe it, an accounting, a detailed, honest description of exactly what had happened that night, the precise sequence of small failures that led to 2 bracelets being switched in a chaotic, understaffed ward, and an apology that did not try to minimize the scope of what her silence, and later Rehana's silence, had cost both families. I do not know if I have fully forgiven her. I know that reading that letter was the first time I stopped thinking of her as an abstract villain in this story, and started thinking of her as a frightened 24-year-old who made one catastrophic mistake, and then compounded it with years of silence, born from fear rather than malice. As Aisha and Lily grew older, they are both approaching their 10th birthdays as I write this, born 3 days apart, a detail that still strikes me as almost unbearably strange every time I think about it. Their relationship settled into something neither Claire nor I could have predicted, and something, I suspect, neither Mark nor Sarah predicted either. They do not behave like sisters exactly, in the sense of shared history and shared home, but they do not behave like ordinary friends either. There is a particular ease between them, an unspoken understanding, that I have come to believe exists, because both girls carry the same unusual knowledge that the family they were raised in was not inevitable, was not simply handed to them by biology, but was something chosen and maintained, actively, by people who could have made different choices. I remember a conversation I overheard between them last summer, the two of them sitting on our back porch steps in the particular golden light of a July evening, unaware that I was inside the kitchen with the window cracked, half listening while I washed dishes. "Do you ever wish you grew up at my house instead?" Lily asked. She had a habit, even at 9, of asking direct questions that most adults spent years learning to avoid. "Sometimes I wonder what it would have been like," Aisha said after a pause. "But I don't wish it. I like my house. I like my mom and dad and Rehana. If I'd grown up at your house, I wouldn't be me anymore. I'd be a different me." "That's a weird way to think about it." "My mom says it's not weird. It's just true," Aisha said. "She says the me that grew up here is the real me now, even if I started out somewhere else on accident." There was a long silence after that, long enough that I nearly went back to my dishes, assuming the conversation had run its natural course. Then Lily spoke again, quieter this time. "I'm glad it was you," she said. I'm glad the mix-up meant I got my mom and dad, even though it's weird to be glad about something that happened by accident to someone else's family too. Does that make sense?" "It makes sense," Aisha said. "I'm glad too. About my family, I mean. Not about the mix-up. The mix-up was bad, but what happened after wasn't bad. It's just different than most people's." I stood at the sink for a long time after that conversation ended, the water running cold over dishes I had stopped washing, thinking about how much more clearly these two children seemed to understand the situation than any of the adults who had spent a year agonizing over how to explain it to them. It has been 2 years now since that Tuesday afternoon in March when I came home early and heard a sentence I was never meant to hear. Aisha is 9 now, and Lily is 9 as well, and the two of them have grown into something that defies easy naming, not sisters exactly, not simply friends, but something in between, something the 4 parents involved have stopped trying to categorize and started simply living. I think, if I am honest, that the hardest part of the entire ordeal was not the discovery itself, nor even the months of legal and administrative untangling that followed. The hardest part was the quiet, private grief that Claire and I each carried alone for a long time. Grief over a version of Aisha's infancy we thought we had lived through together, that turned out to have been, in some biological sense, someone else's story unfolding in parallel to the story of a child who wasn't ours by blood, but was raised by us regardless. There is no support group for that particular grief. There is no card in the greeting card aisle that addresses it. Claire and I had to invent, together, in fumbling late-night conversations at that same kitchen table, an entirely new language for what we were feeling, because nothing in either of our lives had prepared us with the vocabulary for it. I remember one night, perhaps 4 months into the whole process, when Claire finally said something that I think became the foundation for how we both eventually made peace with what had happened. "I keep trying to figure out what I actually lost," she told me, sitting across from me with a mug of tea she wasn't drinking, just holding for the warmth. "And I don't think I lost Aisha, because Aisha is still exactly who she's always been to me. I think what I lost is the story I told myself about how she came to be mine. I lost the neat version, the version where the baby I carried and the daughter I raised were always, simply, the same person. Now I have to carry a messier version instead." "Is the messier version worse?" I asked her. She thought about that for a long time before answering. "I don't think so," she said finally. "I think it's just truer. and I'd rather have something true and complicated than something simple and false. I just wish I hadn't had to lose the simple version to get there. That conversation has stayed with me because I think it captures something essential about how families survive stories like this one, not by pretending the complication away, not by insisting that love alone erases the strangeness of what happened, but by slowly, deliberately choosing to hold the complication and the love together, refusing to let either one cancel out the other. We spend holidays together now, both families, in a rotation that took over a year to establish comfortably. The first Thanksgiving we spent together, at our house, was stiff and awkward, everyone too polite, too careful, conversations circling endlessly around safe, neutral topics, the weather, a home renovation Mark and Sarah were considering, a new restaurant that had opened in Millbrook. But by the second Thanksgiving, something had shifted. Mark brought a pie his own mother had taught him to make, insisted on helping in the kitchen despite Claire's protests, and got into a genuinely heated, genuinely funny argument with my brother-in-law about football that lasted through most of dinner. By the third holiday season, it no longer occurred to anyone to comment on how strange the whole arrangement was. It had simply become how our families operated. Mark, who once stood in a parking lot telling me he didn't owe my daughter anything, now coaches both girls' soccer team on Saturday mornings, and I have watched him cheer for Aisha's goals with the same unguarded joy he shows for Lily's. I asked him once, standing on the sideline during a particularly cold October game, what had changed for him? What had moved him from the guarded, defensive man I'd argued with in that coffee shop parking lot to the man now shouting encouragement at both girls with equal enthusiasm? I stopped waiting to feel something automatic, he told me, his eyes still on the field. I kept waiting for some instinct to kick in, some feeling that would prove Aisha was really mine in some way that mattered. It never came, not the way I expected it to. But somewhere along the way I noticed I'd started worrying about her homework, and remembering her favorite snack, and feeling proud when she scored a goal, and I realized that was the feeling. It had just arrived quietly, without announcing itself, built out of 100 small Saturdays, instead of one dramatic moment of recognition. Sarah and Claire talk on the phone most weeks now, not always about the girls, sometimes about nothing at all, the way old friends do, though they have known each other only 2 years, and came to know each other through the strangest possible circumstance imaginable. Sarah told Claire once that she thinks of their friendship as the one genuinely good thing that grew directly out of the worst thing that ever happened to either of their families, and Claire, who repeated this to me with tears in her eyes, said she felt exactly the same way. Rihanna still works for us. She is, if anything, more essential to our household than she ever was before. Though the nature of her role has shifted, she is no longer simply an employee we pay to manage our home, but something closer to what I imagine an aunt might be, if aunts were chosen rather than given by blood. Aisha still calls her Rihanna, not any more formal title, but there is a particular way she says the name, a particular warmth in it, that tells you everything about what that woman means to her. I think often about the version of this story where I never came home early that Tuesday, where the client meeting had gone ahead as scheduled, where I drove to the office at 2 o'clock instead of pulling into my own driveway. In that version of my life, I never hear the sentence through the door. I never learn the truth. I raise Aisha, and somewhere 40 minutes away, the Whitfields raise Lily, and neither family ever knows what the other lost, or what they'd been given instead. I used to think that version of my life would have been easier, and it would have been, in the narrow sense that ignorance is always, in the short term, easier than truth. But I do not believe, anymore, that it would have been better. Lily would have grown up without ever knowing that somewhere in the world there was a mother whose eyes she carried in her own face. Aisha would have grown up without ever knowing the particular complicated gift of being loved not because of blood, but in spite of its absence. And I would never have learned what I now believe to be the truest thing this whole ordeal taught me, that family is not a fact you're handed at birth. It is a decision, renewed every single day, by every single person who chooses to show up. Rihanna chose that, imperfectly, for 3 silent years, in the only way she knew how. Claire and I have chosen it every day since, in the harder, more honest way, the way that means facing the truth together, instead of carrying it alone. And somewhere, on a soccer field on a Saturday morning, 2 9-year-old girls who share nothing and everything, run down the same patch of grass, laughing at some joke only the 2 of them understand, utterly unaware of how close their whole world came, to never finding this shape at all. Every year now, on the anniversary of that Tuesday in March, Claire and I have a quiet tradition, one we never planned but which simply emerged, the way most meaningful rituals do, out of a single spontaneous gesture that we later decided to repeat. The first anniversary, neither of us mentioned the date out loud, but I came home from work to find Claire sitting at the kitchen table with 2 cups of tea already poured, one across from her at my usual seat, and I understood without being told what evening it was. We sat together for perhaps an hour that first year, not saying very much, simply acknowledging, in the silence, everything the date represented: the fear, the anger, the slow and difficult work of rebuilding trust between us, after I had made the decision to carry that first week alone. We have done the same thing every March since, and it has become, strangely, one of the more sacred evenings of our year, more meaningful in its own way than some of our actual holidays, because it is the one evening we set aside deliberately to remember how close we came to losing each other entirely, over a secret neither of us had asked to be given. Last March, on the 3rd anniversary, Rehana joined us for the first time, at Claire's invitation. The 3 of us sat at that same table, and for the first time, Rehana told us the full story of her own 3 years of silence, not the version she'd given us in fragments during that terrible week 2 years earlier, but a fuller accounting, including the nights she said she had nearly told us, had actually driven to our house intending to confess everything, only to lose her nerve in the driveway and turn around. "I want you to know," she said, "that I do not think what I did was right. I have told myself many versions of the story, where I was protecting everyone, where my silence was some kind of love. But love that requires hiding the truth from the people you claim to love isn't really love. It's fear wearing love's clothes. I understand that now, even if I understood it too late to change what happened." Claire reached across the table and took her hand, the same way she had that first difficult conversation 2 years before, and I found myself thinking, not for the first time, that whatever else this story is a story about hospital error, about secrets, about the strange administrative machinery that occasionally reshuffles human lives, without any regard for the people involved. It is also, at its core, a story about the particular, complicated grace required to keep loving people even after they have failed you, and to let yourself be loved even when you know you don't entirely deserve it. Aisha does not remember, now, a time before she knew about Lily, before she understood her own strange, doubled origin story. It has simply become a fact of her life, woven into her sense of herself, the way other children absorb facts about which hospital they were born in, or which grandparent they're named after. Last month, filling out a school assignment about family trees, she came to me with a puzzled expression and asked whether she should draw 2 trees or 1, and I found myself sitting with her at the kitchen table for the better part of an hour, helping her figure out how to draw a family tree wide enough, and strange enough, and honest enough, to hold everyone who actually belonged in it. We settled, eventually, on 1 tree with 2 sets of roots, twisting up together into a single trunk. Aisha seemed satisfied with this solution. I have thought about it many times since how a 9-year-old girl managed to solve, with a piece of construction paper and a handful of crayons, the same problem that took the adults in her life the better part of 2 exhausting years to work out for themselves.